It was the same routine every day. Jamie would walk into class and sit at his usual desk in the middle row, hoping for a quiet morning. But as soon as Mason strolled in, Jamie knew peace wasn't an option. Jamie braced himself for the inevitable confrontation with Mason, his classmate and the biggest troublemaker in the entire school, at least to him. For reasons beyond Jamie's understanding, Mason always made him the prime target of his relentless teasing. Whether it was pushing his books off his desk or throwing out insults about his clothes, Mason always seemed to be there, waiting for an opportunity. Jamie didn't understand why. To Jamie, it just seemed irrational, like Mason was picking on him for no reason other than he existed. Mason leaned over Jamie's desk that morning, flicking Jamie's pen out of his hand with a smirk. Forgot how to hold a pen. Jamie sighed, pushing his glasses up his nose and reaching down to retrieve the pen. I didn't forget, Mason. Just stop, okay? You're so boring, Mason grumbled, but there was a way he said it. Jamie couldn't quite place it, but it was almost half-hearted. Still, he kept up appearances, shoving Jamie's textbook to the edge of the desk before walking away to the back of the classroom, leaving Jamie irritated. Jamie's friend, Noah, looked over from his spot beside him. Dude, why do you even let him mess with you? Jamie shrugged, his fingers tapping absently on the desk. What am I supposed to do? He's always like this. Yeah, but it's weird, Noah said, frowning as he watched Mason joking with his group of friends in the back. He doesn't mess with anyone else like he messes with you. That was true, and Jamie had noticed. Mason didn't pick on anyone else in the class, at least not with the same consistency. It was like Jamie was his personal project or something. He just shrugged, deciding to not think about it too much. The next week brought with it a dreaded event for Jamie, sports day. While most students were buzzing with excitement, Jamie wasn't particularly athletic, and the idea of participating in front of everyone made him anxious. His only comfort was that Noah had the same disinterest in sports, so they'd likely be sticking together throughout the day. But Jamie's mood darkened when he saw Mason warming up with the school's soccer team. Apparently, Mason was not only the school's troublemaker but also one of the star players. Jamie hadn't paid much attention to that fact before, but today, with the field set up for an all-day soccer tournament, it was impossible to ignore Mason's presence. As Jamie and Noah sat on the bleachers, watching from a safe distance, Mason's voice rang out, loud and commanding. As he took charge of his team's practice, there was a raw energy about him on the field that was different from his usual self. Mason seemed in his element, focused, competitive, and oddly impressive. Wow, I didn't know he took soccer this seriously, Noah muttered as they watched Mason sprint down the field, easily dodging past defenders and scoring a goal. Jamie sighed, crossing his arms. Of course, he's good at it. He's good at everything that's physical. The whistle blew, signaling the start of the first game. As the teams lined up, Jamie couldn't help but notice how Mason's eyes seemed to scan the crowd, lingering for a moment on where he and Noah were sitting. Jamie quickly looked away, feeling uncomfortable under that gaze. As the tournament went on, the atmosphere shifted, and this time, Noah noticed something odd during the breaks between matches. Mason would glance over at them, more specifically, at him. At first, Noah thought it was just a coincidence, but then Mason's gaze became sharper whenever he laughed or leaned in to whisper something to Jamie. It wasn't just annoyance. It was something more, and Noah was starting to figure out what it was. Jamie, oblivious to Mason's glares, kept chatting away. I swear, this is the longest soccer game I've ever watched. How are you holding up? I'm fine, Noah replied, though he wasn't really paying attention to the game anymore. His focus had shifted entirely to Mason, who, even in the middle of playing, seemed to throw quick glances their way. It was weird. He wanted to test it out himself. He waited for Mason to glance their way again, which didn't take long, before he leaned over to Jamie, giving him a playful kiss on the cheek. Jamie, a bit shocked, but not really, because Noah has always teased him like that. He rolled his eyes at Noah, laughing a bit, while using his elbow to playfully hit him, oblivious to the death glares Mason was giving Noah. Noah groaned, while dramatically holding the place he got hit at for emphasis. He then turned back to the field, flinching a bit when he saw Mason, standing in the middle of the field, glaring at him with so much venom. He looks like he wants me 6 feet under, Noah said as they watched one of Mason's teammates tap Noah on the shoulder, successfully getting him to stop standing in the middle of the field and start playing. Jamie just shrugged, oblivious to what just happened. After the match ended and the teams headed to their lockers, Jamie and Noah decided to stretch their legs by walking around the field. They weren't halfway around when Mason approached them, his usual group of friends trailing behind but at a distance. Hey, nerd," Mason greeted, though his eyes flicked briefly to Noah, before landing on Jamie. "Enjoying the game?" Jamie frowned, sensing the edge in Mason's voice. "It's fine. You were pretty good out there." Mason looked slightly taken aback by the compliment, but he recovered quickly. "Yeah, well, it's not like someone like you would understand," he said, but there was no real venom. Mason shoved his hands in his pockets, rocking back on his heels. His friends lingered nearby, watching curiously. Noah, noticing the tension, jumped in. "Dude, don't be such a jerk." The moment Noah spoke, Mason's posture stiffened. He shot Noah a look that was far darker than Jamie expected. "What's your problem?" Noah asked, even though he kinda knew what it was. "My problem?" Mason scoffed, stepping closer. "I don't have a problem with you, all right?" His tone suggested the opposite, and Jamie quickly stepped between them. "Let's just go," Jamie said, grabbing Noah's arm before things escalated. "Come on, Noah." Mason watched them walk away, and though Jamie didn't look back, he could feel Mason's eyes boring into his back the entire way. The next day, at lunch, Jamie sat with Noah, as usual, under the tree near the soccer field. Noah was recounting something funny that had happened in class when Jamie noticed Mason leaning against a nearby wall, his arms crossed as he watched them. "Is he following us?" Noah asked, glancing over. Jamie shook his head, but he wasn't so sure anymore. "Maybe he's just hanging out." But Noah wasn't buying it. "Hanging out? He's glaring like he wants to rip my head off." Jamie glanced back toward Mason, who quickly looked away when their eyes met. It was strange. For the first time, Mason's behavior wasn't just annoying. It was confusing. "What's his deal?" Jamie wondered aloud. "He's been acting so weird lately." Noah shrugged. "Maybe he likes you." Jamie felt a flush of heat rush to his face. "What? That's ridiculous." But Noah just raised an eyebrow. "I'm serious. He's always messing with you, but he doesn't touch anyone else. And now he's glaring at me like I'm some kind of threat. What else could it be?" Jamie opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Later that day, as they were packing up after school, Jamie found himself alone by the lockers. Noah had left early to meet someone, and most of the students had already headed home. Jamie was busy sorting through his bag when he heard footsteps behind him. Without looking, he already knew who it was. "Hey, nerd." Jamie rolled his eyes at the familiar greeting, turning around to find Mason standing a few feet away, his hands shoved in his pockets, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You're still calling me that?" Jamie asked. Mason shrugged, leaning casually against the lockers. "Habit, I guess." Jamie raised an eyebrow. This was new. Usually, Mason would have thrown in an insult by now. But today, he just stood there, almost nervous. It was unsettling. Jamie didn't know what to make of it, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. "Did you need something?" Jamie asked, trying to sound indifferent as he zipped up his bag. Mason hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the floor before meeting Jamie's gaze again. "I wanted to ask you something." Jamie blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift. Mason never asked him anything. Usually, he just demanded or teased. "Okay, what?" For a second, Mason looked like he might actually say something serious. His expression faltered, his mouth opening and closing, as if he was trying to find the right words. But then, he looked up, smiling slightly. "Can you help me with my homework tomorrow, after school?" Mason said. Jamie frowned, confused by the request. He looked like he was about to say something else, but decided not to at the last minute. "What, homework?" Jamie couldn't help but sound confused. "You know, the one Miss Tyler assigned to us," Mason stuttered. "That was last week and it's past the deadline," Jamie said, brows furrowed. "Yeah, and I haven't done it, so your place or mine?" Jamie was taken aback for a while, but then said no one's place and turned around. Before he could walk out, Mason rushed in front of him, holding his hands together. "Please." Jamie's eyes widened, because he had never imagined Mason doing something like this in a million years. "Fine, but we are going to the park," Jamie replied, still not knowing if he should trust Mason or not. "Deal," Mason said, smiling ear to ear, causing Jamie to look at him weirdly. The next day, after school, they went to the park as promised. Mason leaned back on the bench, his legs stretched out in front of him. Jamie sat beside him, flipping through his notes. Mason turned to Jamie with a grin, his tone light but with that edge of playfulness Jamie had come to recognize. "You know, you're always so serious. Bet you don't know how to loosen up." Jamie rolled his eyes, used to Mason's teasing by now. "I'm plenty relaxed. And by the way, we are supposed to be doing your homework." "Really? You're relaxed now?" Mason's grin widened, and Jamie could feel the challenge in his voice. Before Jamie could react, Mason suddenly poked him in the side, right at a sensitive spot Jamie had. Jamie yelped, jerking away with a startled laugh. "Mason, Mason chuckled, clearly pleased with himself. See, I knew you had it in you. Don't do that, Jamie muttered, trying to keep his composure, but his flushed cheeks betrayed him. It wasn't that he was upset. If anything, it was the opposite. Mason's teasing had changed. It was now playful. Mason leaned in, his voice dropping a little lower. Why does it bother you that much? His hand hovered near Jamie's side, threatening to poke him again, but it never made contact. It was the anticipation that got to Jamie. The way Mason played with the line between teasing and something more. Jamie shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't move away. You're impossible, you know that? You're cute when you're flustered, Mason murmured, his voice low and teasing. Jamie's face burned, and he quickly looked away, pretending to be annoyed. Shut up, like I said. We are supposed to be doing your homework. About that, I kinda lied, Mason said slowly, scratching the back of his neck, while looking at Jamie's face cautiously to see the expression he had on. Wait, what? Jamie stood up abruptly, facing Mason in disbelief. So I have been wasting my time here with you. Mason's heart stung a bit hearing those words from him. He stood up too, looking a bit embarrassed. I just wanted to spend. He stopped talking and his demeanor changed suddenly. He shrugged and smirked. It was kinda funny. Jamie raised an eyebrow, shaking his head in disbelief. He then quickly but calmly began taking his things, not even bothering to say anything to Mason before walking home. He couldn't believe he had actually been enjoying Mason's company, only to find out Mason had only thought it was a joke to be hanging out with him. After that day, strange interactions with Mason continued throughout the week. He would show up out of nowhere, hanging around Jamie but never really saying anything of substance. He'd just stand nearby, glancing, not so discreetly at Jamie with an unreadable expression, as though there was something he wanted to say but couldn't. It was driving Jamie crazy. He had no idea what Mason's problem was, and Noah's constant teasing about it wasn't helping. One afternoon, Jamie found himself walking home alone. Noah had practice, so they couldn't go home together. Jamie liked this time of day. The quiet after the chaos of school was comforting, but as he rounded the corner of the main building, he noticed someone leaning against the fence that lined the soccer field. It was Mason. Jamie considered turning the other way, avoiding another awkward encounter, but Mason spotted him before he had the chance. With a resigned sigh, Jamie approached, figuring it was better to get whatever this was over with. What are you doing here? Jamie asked, keeping his tone neutral. Mason shrugged, his gaze focused on something in the distance. Just hanging out. Right, Jamie said, not believing that for a second. There was always something behind Mason's nonchalance, something he wasn't saying. Look, if you're going to say something, can you just get it over with? I've got homework. Mason didn't respond immediately. He continued staring out at the empty soccer field and for a moment, Jamie thought he wasn't going to say anything at all. But then, Mason looked at him. His voice was quieter than Jamie had ever heard it before. I don't get you, Mason muttered. Jamie blinked, thrown off by the statement. What do you mean? Mason shook his head, pushing off the fence and turning to face him. I mean, you're so different from everyone else. I don't get how you're always so calm. It pisses me off. Jamie's eyebrows shot up. That was the last thing he expected to hear. You're mad because I'm calm. Mason ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. You just don't react the way other people do. No matter what I do or say, you don't freak out. You don't fight back. It's like you don't care. Jamie opened his mouth to reply but then paused. Was that why Mason had been picking on him all this time? Because he wanted a reaction. Well, maybe I just don't think it's worth it, Jamie said carefully. Getting into fights and arguments, it doesn't solve anything. Mason sighed, running his hands through his hair. He looked down. I'm sorry, about the other day. What I did was wrong. I just wanted to spend some time. He didn't finish what he was about to say. Before he shut his mouth, it was as if he wanted to say something else, but couldn't bring himself to. Jamie wasn't dumb. He knew what Mason wanted to say. He was going to say something back but Mason didn't wait for Jamie to speak, and he immediately left. A few more days passed after Mason's apology. The atmosphere between them felt heavier now, filled with unsaid words. Jamie wasn't sure if he should push for answers or leave it alone. He was sitting alone under the tree. He had a book open in front of him. And then, there was the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Jamie glanced up to see Mason standing a few feet away, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, a strange look on his face. It wasn't the former smirk or sneer, but something softer, hesitant. Hey, Mason said. Jamie raised an eyebrow. Hey. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mason just stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like he wasn't sure whether to stay or leave. Finally, Jamie broke the silence. Did you need something? Mason hesitated again, his eyes flicking to the ground before meeting Jamie's. I was thinking, maybe you'd want to come watch the soccer practice today. Jamie blinked, completely caught off guard. What? Mason rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. I just figured, you might want to see what it's like, you know, instead of sitting here all the time. Jamie stared at him, trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. But Mason's expression wasn't mocking. If anything, he looked nervous. I guess I could, Jamie said, still unsure where this was coming from. Mason nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. Cool. See you there. And just like that, Mason turned and walked away, leaving Jamie more confused than ever. Later that afternoon, Jamie found himself walking toward the soccer field, still trying to make sense of what was going on with Mason. Mason inviting him to watch practice. That had to be the strangest interaction they'd had so far. When Jamie arrived, the team was already on the field, going through their warm-ups. Mason was easy to spot. He was in the middle of the action, directing his teammates and effortlessly controlling the ball during drills. Jamie found a spot on the bleachers and sat down, keeping a low profile as he watched the practice unfold. Mason was, as always, impressive on the field. It was clear why he was one of the team's star players. As the practice went on, Jamie's mind wandered back to their conversation earlier. Mason had seemed different, less guarded, more uncertain. It was strange to see him like that, especially after all the bullying. But the more Jamie thought about it, the more he realized that Mason's teasing had always been weirdly focused. It was like he went out of his way to get Jamie's attention, even if it was in the worst possible way. Maybe Noah had been right all along. Maybe Mason did have feelings for him. But if that was true, why didn't Mason just say something? Why go through all this trouble to hide it behind insults and teasing? Before Jamie could puzzle it out any further, the whistle blew, signaling the end of practice. The players started to head off the field, and Jamie stood up, preparing to leave. But before he could slip away, Mason jogged over, his hair damp with sweat, a towel slung over his shoulder. You actually came, Mason said, a hint of surprise in his voice. Jamie shrugged, trying to play it cool. Yeah, I guess I was curious. Mason smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't a smirk or a sneer. It was genuine. Glad you did. You should come again sometime. Jamie blinked, unsure how to respond. This was so unlike the Mason he was used to. Before he could say anything, Mason waved and headed toward the locker rooms, leaving Jamie standing there, once again baffled by the strange turn their relationship had taken. A week later, Jamie was in the library, studying for an upcoming test. He was absorbed in his notes, but couldn't help but feel a presence nearby. Hey! Jamie glanced up to see Mason standing by the table. Jamie nodded, gesturing to the chair across from him. Hey, what's up? Mason sat down, looking nervous as he fiddled with the edge of his jacket sleeve. I've been thinking about some stuff. Jamie raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. You know, about you, Mason said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jamie's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment Mason would finally say what he'd been holding back all this time. But just as Mason opened his mouth to continue, the library doors burst open, and a group of noisy students walked in, breaking the quiet atmosphere. Mason's expression immediately hardened, and he stood up, his usual defensive wall snapping back into place. Never mind, Mason muttered, turning to leave. Jamie stood up, reaching out to grab his arm before he could walk away. Mason, wait, but Mason pulled away, shaking his head. Forget it, okay? Just forget I said anything. And with that, he was gone, leaving Jamie standing alone in the library, his chest tight with frustration. The confession was coming. Jamie could feel it, but for now, all he could do was wait. The days passed, and Jamie found himself growing more anxious. The almost confession in the library lingered in his mind, replaying in every quiet moment. Mason had been so close. Jamie could see it in his eyes, hear it in the shaky uncertainty of his voice. But something always held him back, and Jamie couldn't figure out what it was. He found himself almost wishing Mason had confessed. Jamie started watching Mason more than usual, trying to piece together the puzzle. Mason's behavior had shifted again. He still hovered, still made sarcastic comments, but now, they felt more half-hearted. And there was something else, something softer in the way Mason would look at him, like he was waiting for the right moment to let his guard down. Jamie wasn't used to this, waiting for someone to admit their feelings, especially someone like Mason. It made him feel restless, unsure of where they stood. But there was a part of Jamie that wasn't ready to push Mason, afraid that doing so would make him retreat even further. Instead, Jamie let things unfold at their own pace. He still spent time with Noah, still focused on his studies, But the thought of Mason was always there, lingering at the back of his mind. One afternoon, Noah and Jamie were sitting outside the school, waiting for Noah's ride. Jamie was quiet, lost in his thoughts, when Noah suddenly spoke up. "You've been weird lately," Noah said, not looking up from his phone. Jamie blinked, startled by the comment. "What do you mean?" Noah shrugged, glancing at him with a knowing smile. "You know what I mean. You've been distracted. Is it about Mason?" Jamie hesitated, unsure if he should confide in Noah. But Noah was his best friend, and if anyone could help him figure this out, it was him. "Yeah," Jamie admitted, running a hand through his hair. "He's been acting strange, and I don't know what to do about it." Noah raised an eyebrow. "Strange how?" Jamie sighed, trying to find the right words. "I don't know. He's been hanging around more, but he's not as mean. It's like he wants to say something, but every time he tries, he stops himself." Noah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sounds like he's scared." "Scared?" Jamie frowned. "Of what?" "Of telling you how he feels," Noah said matter-of-factly. "Come on, Jamie. It's obvious he likes you. He's probably just terrified of admitting it." Jamie stared at Noah, processing his words. "You think that's it?" "I'm sure of it," Noah said, leaning back against the bench. "He's been teasing you for months, and now that he's trying to be more honest, he doesn't know how. Just give him time. He'll come around." Jamie wanted to believe that, but he wasn't sure if Mason would ever get over whatever was holding him back. Another week passed, and Jamie decided to focus on his own life rather than wait around for Mason. He had enough going on with school and his extracurricular activities, and if Mason wanted to talk, Jamie figured he'd let him come to him when he was ready. One Friday afternoon, after school had ended, Jamie found himself walking home alone. Noah had left early again for student council, and Jamie didn't mind the peaceful walk. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the streets were quiet. It was the kind of afternoon that allowed him to clear his head. He was halfway down his usual route when he heard someone call his name. Turning around, Jamie saw Mason jogging toward him, his expression unusually serious. Jamie's heart skipped a beat. Mason had never come after him like this before. "What are you doing here?" Jamie asked when Mason finally caught up to him. "I need to talk to you," Mason said, his voice breathless but determined. Jamie blinked, surprised by the intensity in his tone. "Okay. About what?" Mason didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down, kicking a small rock on the sidewalk. His brow furrowed like he was struggling to find the right words. Jamie waited, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know I've been a jerk," Mason started, his voice low. "I've been confused for a while, and I didn't know how to deal with it, so I kept messing with you. But it's not what you think." Jamie's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. "What do you mean?" Jamie asked carefully, trying not to push too hard. Mason finally looked up, meeting Jamie's gaze. His eyes were filled with a vulnerability that Jamie had never seen before. "I like you, okay, and I didn't know how to handle it, so I did stupid things I wish I can take back." Jamie's heart stopped for a moment. There it was, the confession he'd been waiting for. But now that it was out in the open, Jamie didn't know how to respond. He had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was happening, his mind went blank. Jamie started, but the words wouldn't come. He was too stunned, even though he had been expecting this. Mason, misinterpreting Jamie's silence, took a step back, his expression darkening. "Forget it," he muttered, turning to leave. "I knew this was a mistake." "No, wait," Jamie called out, grabbing Mason's arm before he could walk away. Mason froze, his back to Jamie, his body tense. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. "I didn't mean to make you feel like that," Jamie said softly, his hand still gripping Mason's arm. I didn't expect this. I mean, I did, but I didn't think it was possible that you felt that way towards me." Mason slowly turned around, his expression wary. "You expected this?" His face heated up in embarrassment. "I mean, it was quite obvious," Jamie shrugged, with a slight smile on his lips. "And you're not mad?" Mason blushed harder, looking down, and Jamie found it cute. How a guy this tall and more muscular than him looked like a cute, lost puppy. Jamie shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "No, I'm not mad." Mason stared at him for a moment, like he was trying to decide whether or not to believe him. Then, he let out a breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I've been trying to tell you for weeks, but every time I tried, I just freaked out." Jamie nodded, understanding now why Mason had been acting so strange. "It's okay, I get it." Mason glanced down at the ground, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "So, what now?" Jamie thought for a moment. This was new territory for both of them. and he didn't want to rush into anything without knowing how they both felt. But he knew one thing for sure. He didn't want to lose Mason. Not now that they were finally being honest with each other. Well, Jamie said slowly, we could start by getting to know each other. You know, without all the insults and teasing. Mason looked up at him, surprised he even suggested that. He has thought that Jamie would want nothing to do with him. A faint smile on his lips. Yeah, I'd like that. The next few weeks were different. Mason no longer hovered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to talk to Jamie. Instead, he started sitting with Jamie and Noah at lunch. Though the teasing never entirely disappeared, it was just softer, less biting. Jamie could see the effort Mason was putting in to change, and while it wasn't always perfect, it was progress. Noah, of course, noticed the shift immediately. So, you two are a thing now? Noah asked one day as they sat under their usual tree. Jamie blushed, glancing at Mason, who was sitting beside him, flipping through a textbook, trying to appear indifferent, but was given away by the blush on his cheek. We're figuring it out. Noah grinned, clearly enjoying the situation. Well, it's about time. I was getting tired of all the drama. Mason rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Instead, he looked at Jamie with a small smile, and Jamie felt his heart skip a beat. Things were different now, but in a good way. As they sat there, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the school grounds, Jamie felt a sense of calm settle over him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't worried about what would happen next. He and Mason had a long way to go, but they were finally on the right path. 2 weeks had passed since then, and they hung out regularly. One day, they ended up at Jamie's house after a long afternoon of studying at the library. It had been a particularly stressful week for Jamie, and Mason had noticed. Instead of dragging Jamie out to do something active, Mason had suggested they just hang out at Jamie's place. A rare moment of consideration that didn't go unnoticed. They settled on Jamie's bed, watching a movie on his laptop. Mason sprawled out comfortably, taking up most of the space as usual, while Jamie tried to focus on the film instead of the way their legs kept brushing against each other. The casual intimacy of it all was still new to Jamie, but he didn't mind. Halfway through the movie, Mason shifted closer, his arm brushing against Jamie's. You're way too into this, Mason teased, his voice low in Jamie's ear. Jamie shot him a look, trying to ignore the flutter in his chest. I'm trying to watch the movie. Mason smirked, not moving an inch. Sure you are. Jamie sighed, but he couldn't hide the small smile that tugged at his lips. Mason always knew how to get under his skin, but in a way that Jamie had started to enjoy. Shut up, Jamie muttered again, but this time, the words were softer, almost playful. Mason leaned in, his lips close to Jamie's ear. Make me. Jamie's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, all he could do was stare at Mason, his heart racing in his chest. Mason's smirk widened, clearly pleased with the effect he was having. Instead of responding, Jamie did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed a pillow and shoved it in Mason's face, laughing as Mason sputtered and pushed it away. Seriously, Mason grumbled, though there was no real annoyance in his voice. He tossed the pillow aside and lunged at Jamie, pinning him to the bed in one swift movement. Jamie's laughter died in his throat as Mason hovered above him, their faces inches apart. Mason's eyes were dark, but there was a playful glint in them, and for a moment, Jamie forgot how to breathe. You're terrible, Jamie muttered, his voice shakier than he intended. Mason just grinned, not moving from his position. Yeah, but you like me anyway. Jamie opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come, because Mason was right. He did like him, more than he cared to admit, and judging by the look in Mason's eyes, Jamie wasn't the only one. The moments between them grew more charged, the teasing more intimate, but still, neither of them pushed too far. It was a delicate balance, one Jamie was learning to navigate. But with every shared glance, every lingering touch, Jamie knew they were heading towards something inevitable, and as much as it terrified him, it also excited him in ways he never thought possible. The end.